Looking back now, it's strange how ordinary the beginning seemed. There were no fireworks, no cinematic sparks that people like to talk about when they describe love at first sight. Instead, it was a quiet introduction at a friend's dinner party, the kind of evening where conversation and wine flow in equal measure. She was seated across from me, and though she wasn't the most striking woman in the room, something about her drew my attention. Maybe it was her eyes, brown, soft, but carrying a flicker of mischief, or the way she laughed as though every word she spoke was an inside joke only she understood. Her name was Evelyn, simple, elegant, and somehow fitting for her presence. She wasn't trying to dazzle anyone, yet she had a way of making the entire table lean just a little closer whenever she spoke. When she asked me questions, she listened, really listened, as though my answers mattered more than the background noise of a crowded room. That night, I left with her number saved in my phone, and though neither of us said it aloud, there was an understanding that this wasn't going to be the last time we spoke. Our first date was equally understated. A walk along the river on a cool evening, followed by coffee in a small cafe tucked between two bookshops. We talked for hours, as if years of unspoken thoughts had been waiting for the right audience. She told me about her work in publishing, her love of travel, her complicated relationship with her parents. I found myself admitting things I usually kept buried, how I'd spent much of my life drifting, how I carried the weight of failed ambitions like stones in my pocket. She didn't flinch at my honesty. She leaned closer, nodding, and I felt something I hadn't in years seen. Weeks turned into months, and soon Evelyn was woven into the fabric of my life. She had this way of making even the simplest routines feel meaningful. Grocery shopping became an adventure with her, as she debated endlessly about which pasta sauce to buy. Lazy Sundays on the couch turned into entire worlds of shared laughter, quiet touches, and whispered secrets. My friends noticed the change in me, how I seemed lighter, more grounded. For the first time in a long while, I believed I might have found someone who understood the fragile parts of me I usually kept hidden. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that love has a cruel sense of timing. Just when you think you found stability, the ground begins to shift beneath you. The first signs were subtle, almost easy to dismiss. A sudden distance in her eyes during conversations. The way her phone seemed to never leave her hand, buzzing late into the night with messages she quickly brushed off as work stuff. The warmth in her touch began to flicker, replaced by moments of distraction, silence stretching longer than it should. I told myself not to overthink it. People go through phases, stress creeps in, relationships ebb and flow, but deep down an unease began to take root. One night as she showered, her phone lit up on the nightstand. A name I didn't recognize flashed across the screen: Daniel. A simple message: "Can't stop thinking about you." My heart slammed against my ribs, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I shouldn't have looked, I knew that. But the truth has a way of clawing its way into the open, no matter how hard you try to ignore it. When she came out, towel wrapped around her, I asked casually who Daniel was. She froze just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. She smiled then, too quickly, and said he was a colleague, nothing more. But the seed of doubt had already been planted, and once planted, it grew like wildfire. Over the next weeks, the cracks widened. She became harder to reach, excuses piling up like debris after a storm. Late nights at the office, sudden trips she couldn't fully explain, vague reassurances that did nothing to ease the gnawing suspicion in my gut. I wanted to believe her, wanted so badly to hold on to the version of us that felt real, but every glance at her phone, every half-hearted kiss, every silence that stretched between us screamed otherwise. I confided in a friend, who told me I was overreacting, that relationships require trust, that maybe I was sabotaging something good with paranoia. But paranoia doesn't send messages at 2 a.m. Paranoia doesn't make someone flinch when you touch their arm, as though your skin no longer feels familiar. Paranoia doesn't create the hollow ache in your chest when you realize you're no longer the first person they think of when they wake. The breaking point came one evening when she said she couldn't come over because she was swamped with deadlines. Restless and unable to shake the feeling, I drove past her apartment. Her car was gone, Hours later, when I finally returned home, I found a message on my phone. "I'll call you tomorrow. Don't worry, it's just work." But I did worry, because something in me already knew the truth, that tomorrow would not bring answers, only more questions. And so, what began as quiet laughter across a dinner table was now unraveling into sleepless nights, gnawing doubts, and a fear I couldn't name out loud, that I had fallen in love with someone who was never truly mine. The following days blurred together, though I remember the gnawing feeling that something inside me was shifting, breaking down in ways I couldn't stop. Evelyn's voice over the phone had grown mechanical, as if she were reading from a script rather than speaking from her heart. "Busy week," she'd say, or "let's talk later." Later never seemed to come. I tried to convince myself it was stress, publishing deadlines, a tough season, but the lie was thin, transparent. I could almost hear it tearing apart with every call that ended too soon, every kiss on the cheek that felt like an afterthought. It was the silence between us that screamed the loudest, unanswered questions hanging heavy in the air. One night, unable to take it anymore, I drove to her apartment unannounced. It was nearly midnight, and I told myself that if she was home, if she was alone, then maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe paranoia had poisoned me, and she'd smile when she saw me, relieved I had come. Her car was outside. The lights in her apartment glowed faintly. My chest tightened with cautious hope. But as I climbed the stairs and reached her door, I froze at the muffled sound of laughter. A man's laughter, deep, unrestrained, so out of place in what I thought of as our sanctuary. My fist hovered over the door, but I couldn't knock. My legs felt like stone. Instead, I stood there in silence, listening. Her laugh followed his, softer, familiar, a melody I had once thought belonged only to me. I backed away, each step heavier than the last, the hallway spinning as I fought to keep from collapsing. I didn't confront her then. I didn't storm inside. I didn't scream. Instead, I drove aimlessly for hours, headlights cutting through the darkness as though they could pierce the fog inside my mind. By the time I parked in front of my own apartment, the sky was already turning gray with dawn. When she called me the next morning, cheerful and casual, I answered with a voice that didn't sound like my own. I played along. I smiled through the phone, though my hands trembled, because the truth was clear now, carved into me with brutal precision. She had already chosen someone else. But I needed proof, something undeniable. Maybe it was pride, maybe desperation, but part of me clung to the hope that I was wrong, that the sound of a man's laugh could be explained away. That night I asked if I could see her. She hesitated, then said she was tired, maybe tomorrow. Tomorrow, always tomorrow. So I waited until she left for work the following day and, like a man possessed, followed her car at a distance. It felt insane, something I never thought I'd do, but reason had long since abandoned me. I trailed her downtown, watched as she parked in front of a cafe I'd never seen her mention. She went inside. Minutes later, Daniel appeared. I didn't need an introduction. The way she looked at him, the way his hand found hers across the table, the way she leaned in, eyes lit with something I hadn't seen in months, it was all the introduction I needed. They weren't colleagues. They weren't friends. They were something far more dangerous, and I was the fool who had loved her enough to blind myself. I left before they noticed me, stomach hollow, chest aching. In the privacy of my car, I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that startled even me. This was it, the confirmation. The betrayal made flesh, sipping coffee across from the woman I thought was mine. That night she called again. Her voice was soft, affectionate even. "I miss you," she said, as if she hadn't spent her afternoon with him. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and played my part, but something inside me snapped. I couldn't keep pretending. "Evelyn," I said carefully, "are you happy?" She hesitated, caught off guard. "Of course, why?" "Because you don't look at me the way you used to. And I think maybe you've found something or someone else." There was a silence so deep I could hear my own pulse pounding in my ears. Then, softly, she said, "I don't want to talk about this right now." And the line went dead. I sat in the dark for hours, phone heavy in my hand, her words echoing. Not denial, not outrage, just avoidance. And in that avoidance, I heard everything she couldn't bring herself to say aloud. For days, I drifted through life like a ghost. Work piled up unread. Friends' calls went unanswered. Food lost its taste. Sleep became a stranger. Every thought circled back to her, to them, to the slow unraveling of everything I believed we were. Finally, I decided I couldn't go on like this. I had to confront her, face to face, strip away the lies and demand the truth I already knew. I drove to her apartment again, this time in broad daylight, my resolve a brittle shield against the storm inside me. When she opened the door, she looked surprised, maybe even guilty. Her hair was tousled, her sweater loose, as though she hadn't expected anyone. Behind her, the faint smell of cologne that wasn't mine lingered in the air. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. She didn't argue. She stepped aside, letting me in, and closed the door. For a long moment we just stood there, the silence between us louder than any words could have been. And then she whispered, almost too softly to hear, "I didn't mean for it to happen." Her eyes filled with tears and mine with fire. Because now the betrayal wasn't suspicion, wasn't paranoia, wasn't half-truths hidden in shadows. It was real. And there was no going back. When Evelyn whispered those words, "I didn't mean for it to happen," something in me shattered. I had braced for denial, maybe even anger, but not this fragile confession. It wasn't shouted or defended. It was simply laid bare, as though she had been carrying its weight for weeks and could no longer hold it in. I should have yelled. I should have stormed out. Instead, I stood frozen, unable to decide whether to pull her into my arms or push her away forever. "How long?" I finally asked, my voice so quiet I barely recognized it. Her lips trembled, eyes darting to the floor. "A few months," she whispered. "It started after that weekend you went to visit your brother. I don't know how it happened. It just did." The room tilted. A few months. That meant the smiles, the touches, the whispered "I love yous," all tainted, coexisting with someone else's fingerprints on her skin. "His name is Daniel," I said flatly, watching her flinch. "Isn't it?" She nodded, silent, guilty. Rage surged through me, hot and blinding. I wanted to break something, anything, to match the destruction inside me. But instead, I sank into her couch, head in my hands, feeling the weight of betrayal press down on me. She sat across from me, crying softly, her tears a cruel echo of the ones I'd shed alone in the dark. "Do you love him?" I asked, finally lifting my eyes to hers. The pause that followed cut deeper than any blade. She opened her mouth, closed it, then whispered, "I don't know." That answer, those 3 words, hurt more than if she had screamed yes, because it meant she wasn't sure if what we had was worth saving. We talked for hours, though it felt less like conversation and more like sifting through rubble. She told me Daniel was exciting, different, that he made her feel alive in ways she hadn't felt in years. And then, with a trembling voice, she added, "But I never stopped caring about you." Care, a word so small, so insufficient. I didn't want her care. I wanted her love, her loyalty, her trust, but those were already fractured beyond repair. That night I left her apartment without a goodbye. I drove home in silence, hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. When I collapsed onto my bed, sleep refused me, as if my mind needed to replay every detail of her confession on an endless loop. The following weeks were a blur of half-hearted attempts at normalcy. I tried burying myself in work, in friends, in meaningless distractions. But no matter where I turned, she was there, in the songs on the radio, in the cafes we once visited, in the ghost of her touch that lingered on my skin. We didn't stop seeing each other, that's the cruelest part. She said she wanted time to figure things out, to sort through her feelings. And like a fool, I agreed. We still met for dinners, still had conversations, sometimes even fell into bed together. But there was always a shadow, a third presence in the room. Daniel. Every time her phone buzzed, I felt my stomach twist. Every time she smiled faintly at a message, I knew it wasn't me on the other end. Yet I couldn't let go. It was as though I'd been chained to her, desperate for scraps of affection, convincing myself that if I just held on long enough, she'd choose me again. One night after one of those hollow evenings together, I caught my reflection in her bathroom mirror and hardly recognized myself. The man staring back had hollow eyes, shoulders slumped with defeat, jaw tight with anger unspoken. I realized I wasn't just losing her, I was losing myself. And yet something darker inside me whispered that this wasn't over. Not yet. I began noticing patterns. She'd disappear on certain nights, always with the same excuses: late meetings, friends in town, too tired. I started to keep track, noting times and dates, piecing together a puzzle I didn't want to solve. My obsession grew, fueled by equal parts love and vengeance. Then came the night that changed everything. She had told me she couldn't see me, another deadline, but something in her tone didn't sit right. I drove near her apartment, parking on a side street. Hours passed, my eyes fixed on her building, until finally, around midnight, I saw her car pull up. She wasn't alone. Daniel stepped out first, laughing, his arm draped casually around her waist. She looked up at him, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in months. The sight pierced me deeper than her confession ever had. It wasn't just betrayal anymore, it was replacement. I gripped the steering wheel, nails digging into the leather, heart hammering against my ribs. I wanted to storm out, confront them both, demand answers, scream until my throat gave out. But I didn't move. I stayed in the shadows, watching as they disappeared into her building together. That image haunted me long after they vanished from sight. It replayed over and over in my mind, until anger crystallized into something sharper. If Evelyn wanted to play her game of indecision, if she wanted to balance me and Daniel on opposite sides of her fragile heart, then I'd stop being the passive one. I'd stop being the man who waited, who begged, who hoped. I would force the truth out into the open. No more shadows, no more silence. The next time we met, I planned to confront her, not with desperate questions but with undeniable evidence. I was done waiting for her to choose. I didn't sleep the night after seeing them together. My body lay still, but my mind was a restless storm, each thought sharper than the last. I pictured her smile, the one she'd given him, so easy and unburdened, and it sliced through me again and again. I knew then I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't live in this limbo, suspended between hope and despair. Something had to break. Over the next few days, I crafted my plan like a man preparing for war. It wasn't about violence. I didn't want that, but about clarity. About dragging into the light the things Evelyn was so determined to keep hidden. If she wanted both worlds, I'd make her choose, even if it destroyed me in the process. I began by reaching out to Daniel. It wasn't hard. A few quick searches gave me his number. My hands shook as I typed the message: "We need to talk. About Evelyn." Hours passed before he responded: "Who is this?" I told him. His reply came quickly: "Meet me. Tomorrow, 7 p.m. at the cafe on 8th. When I walked in, Daniel was already there, seated by the window. He was younger than me, sharper in his suit, his confidence radiating in the way he leaned back in his chair. For a moment, I hated him not just for Evelyn, but for being everything I wasn't: new, exciting, untouched by the years of history that weighed me down. "You're the boyfriend," he said flatly, no pleasantries, no introductions. I corrected, though the word burned in my throat. We danced around the truth for a while, testing each other's resolve until finally I asked the question that had been eating at me. "Do you love her?" Daniel didn't flinch. "Yeah, I do, and she loves me too." His certainty was a blade to my chest, but it was what he said next that truly gutted me. "She told me she's ending things with you. She just hasn't found the right time." I wanted to laugh, to scream, to flip the table and walk out. Instead, I sat there, stunned, realizing I'd been clinging to a fantasy while she'd already chosen. Not me, him. I left the cafe without another word, my legs carrying me down the street though I felt hollow inside. The truth was finally laid bare, but instead of relief, I felt a suffocating weight press down on me. I had forced the truth out into the open, and it had crushed me. That night Evelyn called. Her voice was soft, careful, as though she knew I'd discovered too much. "Can we talk?" she asked. I agreed, but this time I was the one in control. I wasn't walking into her apartment like a wounded lover, begging for scraps of affection. I was walking in as a man who demanded the truth. She looked tired when she opened the door, her eyes rimmed red as if she hadn't slept. For a moment, I saw the woman I'd fallen in love with, vulnerable and fragile, and it nearly undid me. But then I remembered Daniel's certainty, his words echoing in my mind. "I saw you with him," I said, skipping past pleasantries. "I know everything." Her face crumpled. She didn't deny it, she didn't even try. She just sat down, burying her face in her hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant to hurt you like this." "Then why?" I demanded, my voice breaking. "Why string me along? Why make me believe there was still something here?" She lifted her head, eyes glistening. "Because I didn't know how to let go, because part of me still loves you, but Daniel, he's new," I finished for her. "Exciting, different." She didn't answer, but her silence was confirmation enough. Something inside me broke then, not just my love for her, but the illusion I'd built around us. I realized I'd been clinging to memories, to a version of her that no longer existed. The Evelyn who had laughed with me in that cafe, who had held my hand by the river, who had whispered secrets into the dark, that Evelyn was gone. What remained was a woman torn between two worlds, and I was no longer the one she wanted. I stood, the weight of finality pressing on my shoulders. "You don't get to have both," I told her. "Not anymore. So here's your choice, him or me, tonight, right now." Her breath caught, and for a long moment, silence stretched between us. I could see the war in her eyes, the pull of familiarity against the thrill of the new. And then, with a tremor in her voice, she whispered the word I had dreaded all along. "Daniel." The room seemed to collapse around me. My chest tightened, my vision blurred, but I forced myself to stay upright. I nodded slowly, swallowing the pain clawing at my throat. "Then this is goodbye," I said, my voice steady though my world was crumbling. I walked out of her apartment for the last time, the sound of the door clicking shut behind me like the final nail in a coffin. Outside, the city buzzed with life, oblivious to the wreckage inside me. I stood there, staring at the lights, realizing the future I had imagined was gone. Evelyn had chosen, and it wasn't me. But as I stood on that sidewalk, heart shattered, another thought began to creep in, quiet, insidious, impossible to ignore. If this was truly the end, why did it feel like the story wasn't finished yet? The days that followed felt unreal, like I was moving through someone else's life. I went to work, spoke to people, even smiled when required, but inside I was a hollow shell. Evelyn's absence was louder than her presence had ever been. Every corner of my apartment seemed haunted by her, her sweater draped over a chair I hadn't touched, the faint scent of her perfume lingering on the pillow. I couldn't escape her, and worse, I couldn't stop replaying that final moment when she chose Daniel. One word and my world had collapsed. Friends tried to help. They told me it was better to know the truth, better to cut ties now than to keep living in a lie. They told me I'd move on, that someone else would come along. I nodded, pretended to believe them, but late at night, when the city quieted and I was left alone with my thoughts, I wondered if they were wrong. Because how do you move on from someone who felt like home? How do you forget a love that once made every day worth waking up for? And yet slowly, something inside me began to shift. Pain has a strange way of reshaping you, stripping you down until you're forced to confront the core of who you are. In the quiet, I realized how much of myself I had lost trying to hold on to her, how much of my worth I had tied to her presence. I had begged, bargained, even humiliated myself in the hope of being chosen, and in doing so, I had forgotten that I was worth more than being someone's second option. Weeks turned into months, and with each passing day, the wound scarred over just a little. I threw out her sweater, replaced the sheets that smelled of her, and filled my evenings with things that didn't remind me of her laughter. I started running again, pushing my body until the burn in my lungs drowned out the ache in my chest. I picked up books I'd abandoned, reconnected with old friends I'd neglected. It wasn't easy. God, it wasn't easy. But little by little, life began to feel less like survival and more like living. Then one afternoon, as I sat in a cafe reading, I saw her. Evelyn. She walked in, sunlight catching her hair, and for a moment time seemed to stop. My heart lurched, but instead of longing, I felt something else, distance. She was familiar, yes, but no longer mine. She spotted me, froze, and for a second our eyes locked. There was a flicker of something in her expression, regret maybe, or guilt. I'll never know. She walked over, tentative, like a child unsure if they're welcome. "Hi," she said softly. "Hi," I replied, my voice calm. We exchanged a few polite words, nothing more. She told me she and Daniel were together, that things were complicated. I nodded, not out of jealousy, but with the quiet recognition that her choices were no longer my burden to carry. She studied me, perhaps expecting anger or bitterness, but I gave her nothing, because somewhere along the way I had let her go. When she left, I didn't watch her walk away. I went back to my book, back to my coffee, back to the life I was building without her. And in that moment, I realized something profound. Betrayal doesn't define you. It wounds you, yes, but it also teaches you the sharpest truths about yourself. I had loved Evelyn deeply, maybe recklessly, and she had betrayed that love. But I had survived. More than that, I had changed. I was no longer the man who clung desperately to someone slipping away. I was a man who had faced heartbreak, endured it, and emerged stronger. Even now, years later, when I think of her, there's a pang of what could have been. But it's no longer unbearable. It's just a reminder, a scar from a battle I once fought. And scars, I've learned, are not signs of weakness. They're proof that you were strong enough to heal. So this is my story, the story of Evelyn and me. A story of love found and lost, of betrayal and brokenness, of endings I never saw coming. But more importantly, it's the story of how I learned to let go. Because sometimes the greatest twist isn't the betrayal itself. It's discovering that you can survive it, rebuild from it, and even learn to thank it. For without Evelyn, without the pain of losing her, I might never have discovered the strength I carry now. And though she'll never know it, that strength has become the most honest love story of all. The one I finally learned to write with myself.